Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to continue talking about Troop Dupe format, talk this time about a deck that's actually going to run Card Trooper and at least one copy of Machine Duplication. That is none other than T-Hero, specifically T-Hero, in and around the time of the US National. So we are going to assume that we're looking at the time period, perhaps even the day that Adam Cord won, maybe for that tournament itself, acknowledging that at that point in time, T-Hero was really popular. Perfect Circle, not so much. In terms of Destiny Hero variants, Magical Stone Excavation was limited to one, so not so much for DDT. Obviously, Monarchs were important. They won the event. But then also acknowledging that within the last month or so, Matt Peddle had top 8'd the Canadian Nationals with the Machine Aggro or Machine Beatdown deck that we are going to profile later on. So at the point of this, Machines are on the rise, specifically with Trap Dushu, which is actually really bad news for T-Hero. Monarchs are on the rise with Trap Dushu, which is really bad news for T-Hero. T-Hero itself mirror matches would be pretty common. And from that point on, you might find some rogue decks like gadget decks, like Macro Cosmos decks with DD Survivor. So those are also conceivable. For this though, we're going to talk about T-Hero, which to me I think is really a Destiny Hero Malicious toolbox deck. This deck revolved around utilizing Destiny Hero Malicious with Snipe Hunter, with Metamorphosis, as tribute fodder for cards like Jinzo or Dark Magician of Chaos. Crush card target, depending on if you want to actually choose to run it. The profile that I'm going to show you in just a few moments has a copy in the deck, but if you were to go back to this format, you could elect not to include it. Again, it was a prize card during this format and incredibly expensive. But to me, this was a Destiny Hero Malicious toolbox. Obviously, you're going to have Destiny Draw, you're going to have other Destiny Heroes like Dasher and Disc Commander, but to me, this was a Malicious toolbox deck, and I'll hopefully make that clear when we get to the deck profile and then talk about some of the spells and some of the extra deck decisions. Beyond the Destiny Hero package, we're obviously going to focus on cards like Card Trooper, which in and of itself worked as a win condition with cards like Limiter Removal, but also comboed really well with the Machine, or rather with the Destiny Hero package, because you could mill cards like Malicious or Disc Commander or Dasher, which worked really well in the graveyard. But it also had the added benefit of potentially milling cards like Dark Magician of Chaos or spell cards for Dark Magician of Chaos. More on that in a little bit. I alluded to it a couple times, but this is actually going to be one of the last times in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Metamorphosis was legal and used. Obviously, for those of you who have played, you're familiar with Goat format. There's triple Metamorphosis in Goat format, but at the end of that format, it was limited to one. Sometimes, sparingly, people still ran one Scapegoat, X amount of Magician of Faiths, and one Metamorphosis. You could actually still encounter Thousand Eyes Restrict in other formats. You would just encounter them in different situations. When Tsukiyomi was limited to one, and Metamorphosis was at one, and Scapegoats is at one, you just wouldn't really feel like you're playing its Goat control anymore. As a result, Metamorphosis was a hit or miss card for a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh's history after Goat format. However, it was semi-limited from 1 to 2 to begin this format. And I think that really opened up the possibility of this deck. This deck not only was a Malicious deck, it was a Metamorphosis deck. A lot of the games this deck won was by using Metamorphosis on a Malicious to go into Rio Sentry, or using Metamorphosis on Dark Magician of Chaos to win with Cyber Twin Dragon. So Metamorphosis is a huge component of understanding how this deck actually won. Before I do get into the actual profile, I want to really thank everyone who's been watching. I've really enjoyed reading the comments and hearing the feedback. Hopefully, as we continue on over the course of the next few months, we can continue to improve the quality of these videos. The first video, I didn't have my mic on me. I obviously have had my mic for all the videos since then. I have a brand new MacBook where I'm using different software for editing and for recording, so hopefully that element of these videos continues to improve. I was actually able to track down an old school Yu-Gi-Oh banner, perhaps for the background. I have not only the Flaming Eternity one, I also have a Rise of Destiny one with the creator, so hopefully that also gives you a different vibe watching these videos with some type of background, and hopefully we just continue to grow this. I've really enjoyed going back, digging through my old cards, putting these decks together, and hopefully you're enjoying that too. But without further ado, let's take a look at one of the most iconic decks of 2007, specifically the National season, T-Hero. All right, we'll start with 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. This deck, being an incredibly aggressive deck, elected to run the full 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. Unlike the Corn Monarch deck from the other day, this deck is trying to put 8,000 damage on the board as fast as possible, and the triple Cyber Dragon definitely helped achieve that. This deck also elected to run triple Card Trooper. We're talking about Troop Dupe format, and I know the deck that I previewed the other day only ran 2 Card Troopers, but Monarchs and T-Hero are 2 very different beasts. This deck is quite a bit more aggressive and aggro and is trying to put damage on the board as fast as possible and pressure the opponent with cards like Card Trooper. Card Trooper also, of course, comboed with Machine Duplication, and in addition to that, fueled your graveyard, which was a vital element of this deck. For example, this deck elected to run 3 copies of Destiny Hero Malicious, helping denote the T-Hero aspect of this deck's name. In addition to the Malicious, there were also a couple other Destiny Heroes that worked really well in the graveyard. You have Disc Commander and Dasher. So we previewed, or rather profiled, a Destiny Hero deck already, but it was Teledad, where we saw the 3 copies of Malicious, but we did not see Disc Commander or Dasher. Disc Commander was banned for that format, so that would be the reason why Disc Commander was not in the Teledad decks. But Disc Commander filled an interesting role in this format with this deck. One, obviously it was a D-Hero, so that worked with Stratos, it worked with Destiny Draw, it was a good mill with Card Trooper. You had both Call of the Haunted and Premature Burial in a time period where Monsterborn was banned, where Disc Commander was obviously always going to generate value. If you happen to own a Crush Card Virus, it was a really good Crush Card target, so it fit a lot of good roles there. Dasher was used in this deck because, again, all the same reasons. You can mill it, you can discard it, you can use Destiny Draw. There were also some pretty good hits, and even if you're not hitting some of the big ones like Jinzo and Dark Magician of Chaos, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you could, at the bare minimum, even put a Cyber Dragon or a Card Trooper on the field, and when this deck's trying to put as much damage on the field as fast as possible, that Dasher could sometimes really fill that role well, because it would allow you to make an additional special summon on a turn where your opponent might not necessarily be anticipating that. To fill out the Destiny Heroes, we have a Fearmonger. Fearmonger is another Destiny Hero which you would not typically find in Teledad variants. So for us, in these profiles, it's the first time we're talking about Fearmonger. What Fearmonger allowed you to do is when it was destroyed by battle, you could special summon a Destiny Hero during your next standby phase. In the perfect world, maybe you're running a perfect circle, you'd be special summoning a Disc Commander because that would allow you to draw 2 cards. That obviously wasn't always what was going to happen, but even summoning a Malicious or a Dasher was pretty decent. The Malicious gave you another monster on the board for maybe Metamorphosis or a Tribute Summon. Dasher in and of itself was obviously just a big 2100 beater, so the Fearmonger filled a lot of roles. It's also a Crush Card target, so it was a pretty decent card. It also allowed you to brick wall a lot. If you had Disc Commander in the graveyard and your opponent knew you had Fearmonger, it was unlikely that your opponent would just attack into it, fearing that you're just going to draw 2 cards, and although this format was really aggressive, just giving your opponent 2 free cards when you're not able to immediately kill them is probably not a good idea because you yourself might die. And then, of course, we'll finish off our Destiny Hero package with the single copy of Stratos. I think it's interesting looking at this top lineup because a lot of these cards got limited or restricted at the end of this format. Cyber Dragon went to 2, Trooper went to 1, and Malicious went to 2. So a lot of limitations here. From that point on, we have the 2 copies of Snipe Hunter. 2 copies of Snipe Hunter was virtually staple in T-Hero variants. This deck, again, trying to win as fast as possible, is trying to clear your opponent's field. It also allows you to fuel your graveyard by specifically putting Malicious in there, though sometimes putting the Dasher or the Disc Commander can be decent as well. And if you're not putting those into the graveyard, and you have Reborn, or rather Premature or Call of the Haunted, a way to special summon from the graveyard, special summoning something like Dark Magician of Chaos or Jinzo could outright win you the game, especially Dark Magician of Chaos. And if you had one of those hands where you summon Snipe Hunter, you ditch your Malicious, you pop their back row, you banish the Malicious, you use Metamorphosis, then you ditch a Dark Magician of Chaos and you Premature it, well, you just won the game. We'll talk more about some of those plays when we get to the spell lineup, but these 2 big monsters worked not only with the Dasher, but also really well with the Snipe Hunter if you had a way of reviving them. From there, we just have sort of some auxiliary monsters. We have a Sangan and a Morphing Jar. Sangan searched out, obviously, a ton of the targets. We had Card Trooper you could search, Malicious or other Destiny Heroes if you had a dead Deidre. Searching Snipe Hunter was awesome. I guess you could technically search Morphing Jar too. Then this deck elected to run a Morphing Jar because this deck had some pretty significant vulnerabilities to opening really awkward hands where you had some Tribute monsters, some dead Destiny Heroes, maybe a Dasher, and being able to discard your hand usually meant you were discarding cards that you wanted in the graveyard, and then drawing 5 fresh cards in the middle of the game with this deck often meant you were going to win the game, particularly if you're ditching Malicious in some of these monsters, because then you're drawing into calls and prematures, and if you ever resolve Morphing Jar, probably going to win. Obviously, it's really vulnerable to cards like Ryza and Zaborg and Soul Exchange, stuff that we talked about in the Monarch deck last week, even Nobleman of Crossout, but if you get it off, as has often been the case with Morphing Jar, it can be an incredibly powerful one-sided effect. So that's our monster lineup. Just worth noting, if you actually look at the original first T-Hero variant, T ran a singleton copy of Zaborg, and I always find that funny because as a kid, I looked at his deck and I thought, what the heck is this deck trying to do? At that point in time, everybody knew about Perfect Circle, which was a Destiny Hero deck which would run Malicious, it would run the Cyber Dragons and some of these other creatures, but it ran them alongside Monarchs. That was a very typical, well-known deck because it's logical. You de-draw Malicious, you banish it, and you summon Rise, a great combo. I looked at his deck with one Monarch and I got really confused. I'm like, why are you running Jinzo? Jinzo's horrible. Why are you running Snipe Hunter? None of those cards made a lot of sense. But the reason why T ran those cards had to do more with the spell lineup. And when you put this whole deck together, you'd understand why this deck was so popular and powerful during this format. Because it was not trying to win by card advantage. It was trying to win through putting together combinations of cards. We'll start the spells with, of course, the triple Destiny draw. Of course, in any Destiny Hero deck, we're going to run the 3 Destiny draw. Not much to talk about there. We have 2 copies of Brain Control. You could have run 3. I will note that Snatch Steal was legal, as we saw in the last video. So there are basically 3 ways to take your opponent's monsters. I've decided to position this deck as a variant of T-Hero that you might see at the US Nationals. The reason why that's important is Matt Peddle, great player from Canada, got top 8, finished in the top 8 of the Canadian Nationals the prior month, or maybe even in the prior couple weeks, running a machine beatdown deck that we're going to profile in a few weeks. That machine deck ran triple Cyber Phoenix. Cyber Phoenix at the time was a really great way of countering the rise in popularity of Brain Control, and then of course even cards like Snatch Steal and Ring of Destruction. So I elected only to run 2 copies of Brain Control on the assumption that we would be, assuming we were going back to a real event during this time period, paired up against at least a couple machine decks, and I didn't want triple Brain. But we have double Brain and Snatch Steal. Because if you're not playing against machine decks, you can often win the game with these 3 cards, as you might anticipate. From there, we have 2 copies of Metamorphosis. This card was actually unlimited, or semi-limited, but rose up the ban list at the beginning of this format, so you could run 2 copies of Metamorphosis for the first time since GOAT format. Prior to that, it was at 1 in the aftermath of GOAT format. It was actually played at times, even though it was just at 1. Some of the Chaos Return decks from 2006 actually elected to run a copy of Metamorphosis, but this was the first time it was bumped up to 2, and then eventually banned. Banned for good, too. But Metamorphosis was an interesting card that we'll talk more about when we get to the extra deck. From that point on, we have a couple Spell and Trap removal, MST and Heavy Storm. I've elected not to put Giant Trunade in this deck, although people occasionally would run Giant Trunade. You won't find a lot of the top 8 deck lists from this time period running it. The big fear, at least in retrospect, was running into Trap Dust Shoot. Trap Dust Shoot, of course, when chained to Heavy Storm is bad, but getting chained to Giant Trunade is even worse because chances are you were planning on going for game and now you can't go for game at all after they rid you of your best monster. So MST and Heavy Storm. We have Pot of Avarice, which might seem a little bit unusual in a combo aggro deck as opposed to the control deck like the Monarch deck last week, but this deck with the Triple Trooper got through its monsters really, really quickly. So Pot of Avarice was live quite frequently. It could also technically reset your Malicious if you accidentally drew into 2. We had a single copy of Premature, borderline staple, but especially good in this deck when you're running Disc Commander. We had single copy of Machine Duplication. I've elected to profile a deck with 1 Machine Duplication. I could have elected to grab a few more Machine Dupes, showing off a version with 2 or 3. I think it was pretty typical just to run the 1 single Machine Dupe. Honestly, when playing this format now, if you end up playing against people running machines, T-Hero is going to have a lot of trouble, which means you might want to incorporate more copies of Machine Duplication if you think you need more win more, or rather auto-win cards. It's not really win more, it's more of an auto-win card. Because this deck is going to struggle more often than not, but there's obviously the downside of drawing double duplication with no targets. That's the nightmare scenario. You could draw double Card Trooper in this, and then it's okay. It's not overwhelming. So the risk of adding more duplications, every single time you put another duplication in your deck, there's an increased likelihood of drawing dead. Of course, you have Snipe, you have Morphing Guard. There are ways to ditch it when it's dead, but I like to just to profile right now a T-Hero deck with 1 Machine Dupe. If you actually go back and run T-Hero in this format, you might elect to run an additional copy if you find that this deck is struggling against some of the other decks in the format. But then it's sort of a catch-180 because you add more Machine Dupes, and now you might open up the Machine Dupe combo, but now if your opponent has Trap Dust Shoot, you kind of went all in on that machine dupe combo, and now your opponent's ridding you of that combo with Dust Shoot. So it's a tough card to pinpoint the exact number if you were to actually go back and run one of these decks. But again, we're just going to put one in this profile. From that point on, we have a single copy of Limiter Removal. Limiter Removal was limited to 1 at the time. This deck would probably run more copies if it was unlimited, but we're going to run the singleton copy. This card allowed you to win out of nowhere quite frequently. You're running triple Card Trooper, Jinzo, triple Cyber Dragon, but then also cards in the extra deck. We had a Scapegoat. Scapegoat has virtually no synergy in this deck whatsoever. It was merely in the deck to stop your opponent from killing you through OTKs. I personally would probably choose to cut this card if I went back into this format, but I wanted to show off a deck that was authentic to the time period, and a lot of people elected to run Scapegoats in this deck, so there is that. I guess the only synergy, just so that I don't get corrected having no synergies, is you can tribute off Scapegoat tokens to boost your Dasher. But other than that, there were no other obvious synergies in this deck. Metamorphosis could not get Thousand Eyes Restrict. It was banned. So you might be thinking, well, whoa, you have Metamorphosis. You can run a mini Scapegoat engine. Nope. Thousand Eyes was banned. From that point on, we have a single copy of Reinforcements of the Army. This deck doesn't have a ton of warriors to go get. It has really only Stratos and then a couple of the small Destiny heroes. So in and of itself, it wasn't the best in multiples because there was a pretty good likelihood that you would draw them dead. And as you can see with this deck, there's a lot of dead draws. You know, you could draw Dead Rhoda and a Limiter without machines and Metamorphosis with no targets and D heroes with nothing, machine dupes with nothing. So you really do want to limit your amount of dead draws, although opening with Rhoda into Stratos was really good. And then from that point on, the last one to talk about is Nobleman of Crossout. This was not a staple during this format, nor was it a staple in this deck, but I've elected to include it because at Nationals, Gravekeeper Spy was peaking in popularity as a counter to Card Trooper variants. Obviously, the 1900 attack can't get over a 2000 defense monster, so a lot of people would elect to run Nobleman of Crossout at this point if you're running an aggro deck like this, so that you could clear out the spies. From that point on, the trap lineup's really tiny for this deck. There's Mirror Force, because we're at the time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where people basically always have to register a deck with Mirror Force and Torrential Tribute. You know, in retrospect, this deck might have been better with even fewer than the 5 traps that it elected to run. There was Call of the Haunted. This one would have been staple. Even if you were to cut Torrential and Mirror Force, you need to be able to revive Disc Commander, Jinzo, and Dark Magician of Chaos. From that point on, the other one that I would have maintained, even if I were to cut the other 2 mass removal traps, was Ring of Destruction. This deck's really aggro, trying to push through damage. You can ring out of nowhere. And then finally, the last card is the one that you need to decide whether or not you want to include. I alluded to this in the last video, but Crush Card Virus was a prize card. It was not readily accessible to the player base at the time. As a result, unless you had thousands of dollars, your deck was not going to include a copy of Crush Card Virus. However, it was absolutely bonkers in this deck. You had, of course, the typical low dark monsters that you might have imagined when we went through this deck profile. You had the Destiny heroes and you had Sangan. But with this deck, you milled Malicious all of the time. Some of the decks with Destiny Draw, Destiny Heroes, and Crush Card, there were times where Malicious was either limited to 2 or you wouldn't run Card Trooper. Well, in this format, you had triple Trooper. If you just opened Trooper, there was a reasonable chance you're about to just mill Malicious. So then you could Crush Card that Malicious on turn 1 off a free milled Malicious off a Card Trooper. It would put you really far ahead, and you might just, quite frankly, win the game outright. So it was incredibly powerful in this deck. The problem is, when you go back to play old formats, I'm pretty big advocate of trying to be authentic. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind the GOAT format variants that have sort of sprung up. I don't mind that people have rebuilt GOAT decks and made them better. I don't mind that at all. But when I go back and sit down with T-Hero versus Machines, I like the decks to be authentic to the time period. And if everybody wants to go back and rethink a format, I'm totally fine with doing that. I think that's really interesting. But authentic deck profiles, authentic gameplay, I think, is important. Crush is an interesting one. T-Hero has a lot of trouble playing this format. A ton. Trust me. The second you start to play decks with Trap Dust Shoot, like Machine decks, Monarch decks, this deck's win percentage drops off by a considerable amount. And at the beginning of the format, nobody ran Trap Dust Shoot. There were quite a few different reasons why Trap Dust Shoot became popular. This deck was one of them. So with the popularity of T-Hero was the rise of Trap Dust Shoot. It was designed to counteract T-Hero. So as a result, when you're playing this format, if you allow people to run Dust Shoot, you're essentially conceding that you're going to run a T-Hero deck that is not in the best position, because everybody's main decks are starting to run cards like Trap Dust Shoot that are designed to counteract your T-Hero deck. As a result, the win rate for T-Hero when I've played this old format is much, much lower than it may have been at the time if you wanted to play at the beginning of the format. At the beginning of the format, people were running a lot more Monarch decks and Bazoo Return decks and decks that were just not popular by the end. By the end, everybody had these streamlined machine decks that did an incredible job counteracting this deck that's an incredibly combo-centric deck that needs key monsters. You know, a Dust Shoot could leave you with a dead Destiny draw. A Dust Shoot could leave you with Card Trooper, or without a Card Trooper when you have duplication. This deck could get hit by just being left with a bunch of tribute monsters when they take your Snipe Hunter. I mean, there were so many cards that you absolutely needed in your hand, and if your opponent Dust Shooted you, you had a very difficult time counteracting it. As a result, with all that said, I typically let this deck run Crush Card Virus because otherwise its win percentage is really low and nobody ends up wanting to run this deck, although it's really fun. This deck is really fun to play, I'll be honest with you, but it's not that good against machines, particularly machines that run the Dust Shoot. So that's what the main deck looks like, and that's my opinion on the Crush card, whether or not you should allow people to use it if you actually want to go back and play this format. In terms of the extra deck, I'm just going to pinpoint some important cards. There were unlimited extra decks at this time, and I was somewhat reluctant to profile decks from this format just because I would need a really large stack of fusion monsters, but I just kept it simple to the ones that were actually important. Probably the most important one of the whole extra deck was Cyber Twin Dragon. So with Cyber Twin Dragon, you had one level 8 in the whole deck, but with the milling, you often saw your Dark Magician of Chaos, and what you could do is you could Metamorphosis, bring out Dark Magician of Chaos, and bring back Metamorphosis, and then tribute off the Dark Magician of Chaos and bring out Cyber Twin and win the game. I'm going to show you a pretty common sequence in this format where you would end up winning some seemingly out of nowhere. You would, start the turn off by summoning your Snipe Hunter. You would use your Snipe Hunter and ditch a Malicious, and you would destroy perhaps their back row or maybe even their monster. Then you would banish your Malicious, and you would summon another Malicious. And then from that point, you would use your Metamorphosis on the Malicious. And from the extra deck, you would bring out Ryu Senshi. If you're not familiar with Ryu Senshi, maybe you don't play GOAT format, it allows you to pay 1,000 life points to stop a normal trap card. So you could utilize this, rather any trap card, but you could utilize this on a trap card. So it would stop your opponent's Torrential Tributes, it would stop your opponent's Mirror Forces, Ring of Destructions, you name it. Then you could banish your next Malicious and special summon the third Malicious. And let's say you hadn't used your normal summon. Let's say your Snipe Hunter was already on the field prior to trying this play. If you were able to tribute these off for a Dark Magician of Chaos, or even on the following turn, like let's say you just left Malicious in the graveyard, you decided to protect your Snipe Hunter. If you were then able to follow up on the second turn by tributing off these two monsters, you could bring back the Metamorphosis and then use the Metamorphosis here, banishing your Dark Magician of Chaos, but summoning Cyber Twin Dragon. And then with the trap protection of Ryu Senshi, you would win the game with the Cyber Twin Dragon. This was a really common end board when this deck actually ended up winning, was to go into the Cyber Twin. So Cyber Twin was arguably one of the most important cards. From that point, as I just referenced, Ryu Senshi was obviously really useful. It's a level 6, so we need to think about exactly what it is we're toolboxing, and the big toolbox here was Metamorphosis and Malicious. This was the big toolbox. So from that point on, you obviously had Darkblade as you would in GOAT format. This fusion deck's going to look a lot like GOAT format. You could take your opponent's Malicious. Sometimes you'd go into it. Obviously, the circumstances didn't always warrant it. An Ojama King, which I do not have an ultimate of. I'll find an ultimate. You had some sort of fringe ones like Dark Flare Dragon. That one wasn't super popular. You had the level 5s, though this deck didn't actually run any level 5s. We have to remember we are running Brain Control and Snaps, so although we weren't running any of the level 5s, you could easily take your opponent's Zaborg. And T actually ran a single copy of Zaborg at the beginning of the format, so not inconceivable that he was going into some of these at the beginning of the format. You obviously want a level 4, you obviously want a level 3. This deck doesn't really have access to level 7s, nor were level 7s particularly popular, but you had some really good level 7s. The one card that I could not find that I once had somewhere that was arguably one of the most important cards was Steam Gyroid, of all things. It was a no-effect fusion monster level 6, so it worked with these two, but it was the highest level 6 machine that you could summon. The reason I'm bringing that up is with limiter removal in your deck, you were, as much more than you might anticipate, in a position to, out of nowhere, limiter removal without actually ever normal summoning a machine monster. Oftentimes you would be using extra deck machine monsters, and then you would win the game seemingly out of nowhere, and you might surprise your opponent. Other cards that were important for a similar sense are even cards like Cybersaurus, because it's a level 5 machine. If there was a machine, you wanted it in your extra deck. Whether it was Labyrinth of the Nightmare, technically you could put Metal Dragon. This one was weaker than Steam Gyroid, so you wouldn't actually run Metal Dragon, but if there was a machine that you could have from the extra deck, just because you ran limiter removal, you needed to put it in the extra deck. I don't care what level it was, all of them, because you're running Brain, and Snatch, and Metamorphosis, and Limiter, and this deck just wins out of nowhere trying to combine things like that. So those are some of the sort of important extra deck monsters that you might not actually anticipate being super important. In terms of a side deck, I elected not to build one for this deck because we profiled a pretty extensive side deck with the Khorne Monarch deck, and this deck was so combo-centric. The cards that you would put in the side deck were cards like Royal Decree, cards that you would anticipate in combo-centric decks, because this deck couldn't really side out too many cards. Obviously, you had Nobleman, which might not always be good. I wasn't a fan of Scapegoats in the first place, that I would always side out if I was running this. You can win games without Pot of Avarice in your deck. It's not a combo piece. It's more of a piece to the puzzle that might not necessarily always hit. So there were cards in your deck that you could side out, but this deck had such a mass of combo pieces, it was hard to side. One of the things that's interesting, and I might profile it eventually, were variants of decks during this format that actually sided into T-Hero variants. So their main deck was a Machine deck or a Monarch deck, and they sided Destiny Draws and Malicious, and they smokescreen between every game. I wasn't a huge fan of that at all. I'd much rather have a comprehensive side deck, but that is something to note when talking about side decks in this deck. The actual critical mass of cards necessary to run T-Hero, as in regards to T-Hero as opposed to other variants, was actually pretty small. If you were just to pinpoint the T-Hero specific cards in this deck, you would have the pile here. So people actually sided a pile that looked just like this. They would have, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 on the dot. So this package that I just took out could easily be side decked, and then you would be left with a deck that still had 3 Cyber Dragons and 3 Card Troopers, right? So that could be played in just about everything. All right, Snipe Hunter's not the best in some decks, but it's a playable. Jinzo's, kind of mediocre in some decks, but it's playable. Sangin and Morphin Jar, great. That's your monster lineup. You have Brain Controls. All right, those are good in a lot of decks. Snatch Steal, still good. Spell and Trap Removal are still good. That's still good. You're running Card Trooper, so that's fine. Pot Avarice is fine. Nobleman's kind of whatever, but it's there. I am not a huge fan of Scapegoats, but it's fine. Hey, these traps are all playable. That 15 cards that I just took out was actually the perfect amount to rotate into other decks. You could very easily transition side with this format into machines. There were machine variants that basically played every single card on the table currently. There were machine variants that played Snipe Hunter, that played Jinzo and things like that. And even if you were to do that, some of the machine decks, like Philly Lunas, actually ran Dark Magician of Chaos. And obviously, if you're going to play the machines, you can put Limiter. So now all of a sudden, you have a couple extra cards in your side deck that you could rotate in. So I'm not going to talk about a T-Hero side deck, but now that I have the T-Hero cards out, I think it is interesting to see that the T-Hero package was almost 15 cards exactly, and it gave you a lot of ability to rotate and totally smokescreen and change your deck into something else if the situation warranted it.